Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, in this special episode, we're going to delve into a topic that's as important as it is heartbreakingly overlooked. Tonight, we're talking about the Crimean Tatars and the tragic history of deportation, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and rights. So, buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through time, injustice, and the kind of perseverance that makes you think, wow, humans really can be amazing despite everything. Let's take a look at our report to find out more.
These men are members of the Crim Battalion, a unit comprised mostly of Crimean Tatars, fighting in the ranks of Ukrainian army, hoping to reclaim their land, the Crimean Peninsula.
I see our future in Crimea, free from invaders. Our future is in free Ukraine, free from invaders.
Although made up of an international crew of soldiers, the members of the battalion all have one thing in common. In one way or another, their people were harmed by Russia.
The Crim Battalion is multinational. Crimean Tatars, as well as Chechens and other nations that fell under repressions, they suffered a lot under these Russian invaders. They know how it feels.
But who exactly are the Crimean Tatars, and why is their relationship with Russia so strained? Throughout history, Crimea has been a highly contested region, with ancient Greeks, Romans, Mongols and Turks vying to control at times. The Russian Tsar annexed Crimea in the 18th century from the Crimean Tatars, recognizing its strategic importance in controlling the Black Sea. During World War II, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin accused the Crimean Tatars of collaborating with the Nazis, leading to their mass deportation to Central Asia. Almost 200,000 or more than a half of the population did not survive. In the 1980s, the survivors and their families were allowed to return to the peninsula. Following the Russian annexation in 2014, however, a transformation of the region under Moscow's control began. The repressions included a crackdown on dissent, with critics, including Crimean Tatars, facing imprisonment for alleged extremism.
And now, as always, it's time to delve into our story in greater detail. So, let's begin. First up, let's set the scene. May the 18th in Ukraine marks the day of remembrance for the victims of the Crimean Tatar genocide. In 1944, over just 3 days, from the 18th to the 20th of May, Soviet authorities deported nearly 190,000 Crimean Tatars from their homeland. Why? Well, in the grand tradition of the Soviet policies that blend paranoia with a complete lack of empathy, the official story was that Crimean Tatars were collaborating with Nazi Germany. The real reason? A grotesque cocktail of ethnic cleansing and a desire to erase any claims to autonomy the Tatar population might have had. In other words, it was a full-blown genocide. If you think Adolf Hitler was the only one to do things like that during World War II, think again. He and Stalin were pretty much cut from the same cloth. So this policy wasn't really unique to the Crimean Tatars. The Soviet Union was quite egalitarian in its ethnic persecutions, targeting Chechens, Bulgarians, Greeks and more in its quest to Russify everything. But let's indeed focus on the Crimean Tatars, a group who, despite enduring one of the most brutal episodes of forced migration in human history, has managed to keep their culture, their language and their identity intact. For 45 years, they fought for the right to return to Crimea, making the world's most peaceful yet determined group project. And guess what? They started coming back in the late 80s and the early 90s. Now, you would think this story might have a happy ending, right? Well, hold on to your geopolitical hats. Despite their return, Crimean Tatars faced a new set of challenges. From local, then Soviet authorities, who were about as welcoming as a porcupine in a balloon factory, and then, just when things couldn't get more complicated, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And here is the kicker. Russians still see the Crimean Tatars as a thorn in their side, a reminder that Crimea's history and identity extend far beyond Russian narratives. It's like trying to erase someone from a group photo by drawing over them with a Sharpie. It doesn't change the fact that they were there. So, What can we learn from the story of the Crimean Tatars? First, that the resilience of the human spirit is something to be marveled at. And second, but history isn't just about the past. The Crimean Tatars aren't a footnote in history. They're a testament to the strength of identity, culture, and the unending quest for justice. And now, here to shed more light on the issue today is our guest, Lia Motryczko, a Crimean Tatar activist. Hello, welcome to TVP World. I'm glad that you could join us here today.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me and giving me a platform to talk about such important things about Crimea, about Crimean Tatars and our struggles.
So the struggle isn't actually anything new. It began years ago, decades ago, with the Stalinist genocide. Now, that genocide was conducted by means of forced deportation, essentially. Thousands died. Later on, the presence of Crimean Tatar community saw a resurgence in Crimea, but after that, 2014, the annexation, and this is where another dark chapter began. Can you tell us more about how did the Russian persecution look like at the start, and how does it look today, over all those years, ever since the first Russian aggression against Ukraine?
So, as you know, during the Soviet Union, Crimean Tatars were subjected to genocide as our whole nation was deported from Crimea to Central Asia. And this was done for the sole purpose of replacing the indigenous population of Crimea with Russians, and thus make Crimea the Russian land. Since the occupation of Crimea in 2014, we can see that Russia uses the same methods, the same tactics as during the Soviet Union of destroying the Crimean Tatars. Right now in Crimea, hybrid deportation is taking place. Basically, Russians create such conditions for the Crimean Tatars in Crimea that they're forced to leave the peninsula. Arrests, kidnappings of activists, searches in the houses of Crimean Tatars is the reality of today's Crimea. Most cases of human rights violation in Crimea happen specifically against Crimean Tatars. And while the Crimean Tatars are leaving the peninsula, Crimea is being repopulated by the Russian population. For example, since 2014, more than 1 million of Russians moved to Crimea from different Russian regions.
So this is almost as if history is repeating itself. Some time ago, you posted a chilling post on Twitter showing you and one of your ancestors and drawing parallels in your life stories, right? Because due to the Russian activities, the Russian persecution, neither your ancestors nor yourself are able to enjoy the simple fact of living in the place where your entire nation, your entire culture originates from. So can you tell us more about the impact that this persecution had on your life, not just as an activist, but on an everyday basis?
Okay, so in 2014, my family refused to get the Russian passports because we identify as Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars and not Russians. And we became foreigners on our own land. Because of the persecutions and because of our pro-Ukrainian position, my family had to leave Crimea. And for the last 10 years, we've been living in exile, just as my ancestors who suffered from the Soviets, as they were deported from Crimea to Uzbekistan and to Ural in 1944. So my mom and my grandparents, they were all born in places of the deportation. And unfortunately, now we are forced to live in exile again, far away from our homeland, far away from Crimea.
So Russia obviously wants to use the very same tactics. They want to not just politically dominate the peninsula, but also they want to uproot an entire culture, an entire nation. They want to erase all traces. But nevertheless, the Crimean Tatar culture has survived. Can you tell us more about the impact that this situation had on the cultural life, on your heritage, on everything that makes you who you are?
So unfortunately, the long-term ban on the Crimean Tatar language led to the fact that UNESCO listed it among the endangered languages. And now the situation is very difficult because since 2014, the teaching of the Crimean Tatar language in Crimea has decreased significantly. In Crimea, unfortunately, the Russian language dominates, and there is a Russification.
Is it still legal to learn the language?
It's legal. But there are no options because there are no schools.
All right.
So the Russian authorities in Crimea are trying to erase the Crimean Tatar identity and impose the Russian identity on people there instead, especially on children, because they try to educate children in schools there so they don't remember their roots, their history, traditions, and culture.
So essentially, Russia is doing the same things over and over again. I mean, in Polish history, this was very similar. The Polish language wasn't even something that you were supposed to learn. You actually had to attend secret classes. So here they are pretending like you can learn the language, but as you're saying, it doesn't really make sense because you don't have any places to go to, no schools that you can learn the language officially. So let's move on now to human rights issues, because this is something that you've been fighting for. You were showing videos from people being arrested and all those signs of persecution that's still going on there. So what are the most pressing issues when it comes to human rights? What reasons are being given, for example, for the arrests, and what prison terms are being imposed on indigenous people of Crimea?
For example, last week the occupiers conducted illegal raids in 10 houses of Crimean Tatars, after which they detained people for false accusations. And such actions happen almost every week recently. Russians do it for two reasons. They can't accept the existence of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. They can't accept our indigenous status to this land. And secondly, they know that the majority of us support Ukraine and that we oppose the Russian annexation of Crimea. That is why they want to scare us, they want to silence us by detaining and kidnapping people in Crimea. And in Crimea, there are about 300 of prisoners, the majority of whom are the representative of the indigenous population. There were cases when these people were tortured in prisons, and many political prisoners were also sent to distant regions of Russia, which is obviously illegal. And unfortunately, this is not only the reality of Crimea, but also of the new occupied territories of Ukraine, because Russians also persecute Crimean Tatars, for example, in Kherson region, accusing them of the participation in the Crimean Tatar battalion. Also in Crimea, even peaceful gatherings for traditional commemorative events, such as the anniversary of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, are banned. And this ban is aimed at eradicating our historical memory and justifying the crimes of the Soviet communist regime.
And the false accusations which are being used, what are those specifically? I remember way before the war, the Russians were pretending to have discovered a fundamentalist Islamic cell in Crimea. And obviously there was nothing of the sort. There were no indications that any Crimean Tatars were involved in terrorist activities of any kind, violent activities. But Russians, obviously, they have their own idea, so they pretended like this was the reason. Is it still the case that they are labeling people as fundamentalists?
Yes, it's still the case. They also persecute Muslims in Crimea, accusing them of participating in the terrorist organizations. This is just the main accusation that they use, that we are the terrorists.
So it's still the same, even after those years from the annexation of Crimea. So trumped-up charges, false accusations, intimidation. Now, when it comes to the international arena, do you feel that there are any countries or communities which are supportive of your cause? I'm asking this question because, unfortunately, due to the war, due to everything that's happening around the world, the public opinion sometimes tends to forget about very important stories, such as the persecution of Crimean Tatars in Crimea and beyond, in occupied territories. Would you say that there are any countries which have supported you more than others in trying to raise awareness of what's going on?
Yes, and it's Ukraine. Ukraine supports the most Crimean Tatars among different countries. And actually, like, we have the only representative body of the Crimean Tatars, which is the Majlis, and it was banned and expelled from Crimea in 2014, and now they're based in Kiev. And so the Crimean Tatar leaders and activists, they are all supported by Ukraine, and they've been raising awareness of the issue of human rights in Crimea on the international stage.
And just a quick question, would you say that other countries belonging to the group of Turkic countries, like, for example, Turkey itself, have they made any efforts to raise awareness of the issue, to provide support during those difficult times?
Yes, of course, Turkey supports Crimean Tatars too, and our leaders, our activists, they're constantly talk with Turkic politics and activists too.
So the struggle goes on, and as you've mentioned, there are many different ways in which Russia has been persecuting the members of the community, but luckily there is still the sort of enduring spirit and an enduring identity to preserve the heritage that goes back hundreds of years, and that simple persecution and political actions of Russia will never erase. So this is the story that really the world needs to know and needs to think about, despite the fact that there are many other things going on, something not to be forgotten. Lia Motreczko was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your experiences.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I think it's important to spread awareness outside of Crimea about the human rights violation of Crimean Tatars. And it's important to support Ukraine right now and the armed forces of Ukraine, because only our soldiers can liberate Crimea from Russian occupation.
Very much so. It is a critical time. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. In a landmark speech in Budapest, the US ambassador to Hungary took aim at the controversial foreign policy of Hungary's longtime Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán. The ambassador expressed concerns about Budapest's growing relationship with Moscow and its policies that undermine trust and friendship with NATO allies.
Ever since the onset of the war in Ukraine, all NATO and EU partners have openly criticized Vladimir Putin and embarked on a path of cooperation to help the war-torn country. All partners but Hungary, led by its Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who has maintained his grip on power for 14 years. In a recent speech, US Ambassador to Hungary David Pressman criticized Budapest for labeling the United States as an adversary and Orbán's warm ties with Moscow. He also criticized Hungary's calls to cut off military support to Ukraine and its undemocratic actions such as seizing independent media and favoring businesses owned by party leaders. Despite wanting dialogue and a relationship based on democratic values, the US leadership's efforts to improve relations have not been reciprocated by the Hungarian government. Tensions escalated further after President Joe Biden's comment on Orbán's views on democracy, leading to a dispute between the two governments.
Russia is conducting a presidential election that is widely anticipated to extend Vladimir Putin's rule well into the 2030s, to nobody's surprise. Scheduled to take place over 3 days, from Friday to Sunday, the election is really more of a procedural formality to perpetuate Putin's dominance in Russian politics than anything else.
Every 6 years, Russian citizens are given an opportunity to feel what it's like to participate in a democracy. All this, however, is a mere illusion, as the outcome of the elections is known long before they take place. Critics both within and outside Russia have long decried the country's electoral system as neither free nor fair. The absence of genuine competition hinders any potential challengers to Putin's authority. Most notably, the only anti-war candidate has been disqualified from running, leaving Putin's re-election virtually uncontested. Beyond the electoral realm, The Kremlin worked tirelessly to promote Putin's image, often resorting to exaggerated narratives to boost his standing among the population. Also, the suppression of dissent extends to restrictions on protests, making public opposition a risky and rarely seen occurrence. Officials are trying to encourage citizens to vote, promising free lunches, concert tickets and raffles for prizes, ranging from bags of sugar to a new car. Residents of the Altai Republic, for instance, will have the chance to win brand new sanctioned goods such as an iPhone 15 or hairstyling devices produced by British household appliances giant Dyson.
While flying over northern Poland recently, a plane carrying British Defence Minister Grant Shapps lost its GPS signal. Many argue there is no doubt that it was a deliberate act by Russia using its military hardware placed in Kaliningrad.
Since the escalation of tensions with Moscow, Poland frequently experiences GPS signal disruptions, especially in the north of the country. According to recent reports from a government insider and accompanying journalists, it is suspected that Russia disrupted the satellite communication of the aircraft carrying the British defense minister as it flew near Russia's Kaliningrad region. The disruption, which lasted around 30 minutes, resulted in the loss of GPS signal, rendering mobile internet connections unavailable, prompting the aircraft to resort to alternative means for navigation. Luckily, the event didn't pose any serious risk to the plane or its passengers, but if intentionally caused by Russia, this would mark yet another instance in Moscow's ongoing hybrid war.
Marine Le Pen, the former leader of the French far-right National Rally, has long been known for her close ties to Russia. In a surprising move, she criticized Russia's war in Ukraine during a recent parliamentary debate.
Despite previously echoing Kremlin sentiments on Ukraine, Marine Le Pen condemned Russia's actions, acknowledging the suffering inflicted on the Ukrainian people and praising their resistance against Russian aggression. She also criticized President Macron for potentially bolstering Putin's confidence with his remarks about the possibility of Western troops in Ukraine. Macron initially suggested such a possibility, but later clarified that France does not plan to send troops to Ukraine in the near future, emphasizing support for Ukraine on its own territory.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.